Welcome to the first episode of the League Express podcast. My name's Jake Kearnan and I'm joined here by the editor of League Express, Martyn Sadler. Martyn, how are you going?
I'm fine, Jake. It's good to join you, and it's a new venture, this, isn't it? So we hope we get a few people watching, and we hope we can keep them entertained. That's the object.
Absolutely. And at a crucial time too, we're slowly approaching playoffs. We've got the Challenge Cup final next weekend as well.
Absolutely.
So it's an exciting time for rugby league here in the north.
An awful lot to look forward to, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So just to start with, Martyn, for those that don't know you or are watching this, listening to it for the first time, can you tell us a little bit about your backstory and League Express?
Well, I've been the editor of League Express for probably nearly 30 years now, so it's a long story. But we started League Express back in 1990 when it became a lot easier to produce independent newspapers, and we've been going strong ever since. So and I come from a background where I started watching the game through my father, who was a great Wakefield Trinity fan. And I've been, that started when I was about 4 years old, and I'm a little bit older than that now. So, I've been a rugby league fan virtually all my life, I think it's true to say.
A lot of us are just born into it, aren't we? I know.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah. For myself, like coming from Australia, I'm sure people can probably hear the accent.
Yeah,
for those that are listening to it.
Yeah.
Growing up a staunch Brisbane Broncos fan, and
you're a Brisbane kid, presumably.
Yeah, well, I was born in Toowoomba, which is an hour or so west of
Yeah.
Brisbane. So my father was a mad Brisbane Broncos fan, and that's how I fell into it. But yeah, I guess how have you seen the rugby league media landscape change over the years?
Well, when I was a kid, all the major national newspapers in this country had rugby league correspondents who were quite well known. They were quite famous, some quite famous names. Jack Bentley at the Daily Express, Arthur Brooks at the Daily Mirror, Phil King at the Sunday People, Eddie Waring at the Sunday Pictorial, which became the Sunday Mirror. All sorts of guys were involved in rugby league. Those people like that don't exist anymore. Rugby league now is mainly reported on online by various media outlets that have an online presence, but for the most part don't have any printed newspapers. So it's changed incredibly, and I'm sad to say, actually, Jake, that the British media, for the most part, just don't cover rugby league give it as much depth as they did in those long ago days before the internet was ever thought of. So it has changed a lot, but we've managed to keep going, and we do have a digital version of League Express that people can subscribe to that comes out on a Sunday night at about 9 o'clock. So you don't have to wait till Monday to read the paper. You can actually log in on a Sunday evening to see what the contents are, and a lot of people do that. It's a growing area, and of course we've got the website totalrl.com that covers news on a 24-hour rolling basis. So I think we've got most options covered, but we've not had a viable podcast until now, which is why it's great to see you here and great to be talking with you.
Oh, absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity. It's a real privilege to be here with you. But I guess for me, growing up in Australia, we had the Rugby League Week magazine, and
which I used to subscribe to as a kid. Yeah. What great days!
Oh,
I used to look forward to that coming every week.
Yeah, and we had the middle of the magazine was the they'd always have a poster of
they
a player.
Would, yeah.
And I remember growing up, I had them plastered all over my walls, and yeah, just when I came over here to England, seeing the League Express on the stores in the shops was. It was almost euphoric.
Yes, I bet. Well, it's good of you to say that. Yeah. I used to love the front pages of the old Rugby League Week as well. They were iconic, some iconic front pages, especially when it got to grand final time. Oh, yeah. And some of the writers, were I just thought were really great, and I loved reading them. And it was very, very sad when that publication, finally came to an end.
Yeah, no, it was definitely very sad, but. We better get into it because we don't want to keep our listeners for too long. We could sit here and talk all day about it.
Yeah.
But just in this episode, we're going to touch on a few things. Obviously, there's a lot of rugby league news happening around the place this week. over the weekend, we saw Warrington Wolves head coach get mutually agreed to part ways. We've also seen a bit of controversy around John Asiata and his tackling technique.
Absolutely.
And we've also had the IRL convening in Singapore, I believe, this week to discuss the future of the World Cup. So a few topics we will delve into, but I guess to get underway, we'll have a quick look at the round that's been. Now, for me, Martyn, you're probably more across this than I, but looking at some of the scorelines, I think there was a few surprises this weekend.
Yeah.
Namely, I'll start off with the Wigan Warriors over Lee. Did you see this scoreline coming?
I thought it would do, because I thought Lee would be. You've got to remember, Lee had just had a euphoric win in the Challenge Cup semi-final. They'd beaten St Helens, and it was a massive achievement to beat St Helens in a cup semi-final. And I knew that with just a couple of weeks to go before the Challenge Cup final, Lee would find it very difficult to come back from that semi-final win and maintain the same level of intensity. Wigan, on the other hand, had a very disappointing Challenge Cup final, semi-final defeat to Hull Kingston Rovers. And I also, knowing Wigan as I do, and knowing Matty Peat, the coach, as I do, or at least as I think I do, there was no doubt in my mind that they would want to come bouncing back at full pelt and show Lee what they were made of. And of course, you've got to bear in mind as well that Wigan and Lee are both in the same Wigan Metropolitan Borough. And this derby game, is being billed as the Battle of the Borough. And Wigan won at Lee earlier in the year, and I always thought they were going to win comfortably this time again. And that's no criticism of Lee, but I think when you get to a Challenge Cup final, it does take a bit of steam out of you for a while until the final is played. And Lee play again this weekend on Sunday when they're away at Leeds, and I think Lee may struggle a bit in that game as well. Really, I could be wrong, of course. They might, but I don't know what their team is yet, of course, because it's not been published. But I have a funny feeling that Lee will be reserving all their artillery for the Challenge Cup final, not for the trip to Leeds this week.
Because I think if the Hull KR, it looks like they're resting a lot of their players.
They are for this weekend. Yeah. They play at home away on Friday night at Wigan. And I'd be very, very surprised if Wigan didn't get another big win there.
Yeah, exactly. What does this performance, you think, say about Wigan going forward? I think it almost, they've announced that they're here to be contenders, aren't they?
Wigan are incredibly dangerous. If you support another team, I think Wigan. It's very rare that Wigan either don't win a trophy or are not contenders in a major final. Obviously, last year they won the Challenge Cup when it was played at. The final was played at Tottenham Hotspur. This year they're not in the final, but they will be aiming for the grand final. And I think they've got as good a chance as anybody. I mean, they are now in second place in Super League. Catalans are obviously on top. And I think it wouldn't surprise me greatly if it was a Wigan Catalans grand final this year.
And touching on Catalans, they obviously had a very solid win over Salford, 42-0.
Yeah.
Did that surprise you at all? Did you see that?
Not really. Salford had sold Tyler Dupree to Wigan a few days earlier. Salford, they've done really well over the last couple of years, mainly because they've had a very consistent spine with Ryan Brearley, Brodie Croft, Max Sneed and Andy Ackers. But the problem for Salford is their pack isn't as strong as some of the other teams in Super League, and particularly when they went to Catalans Dragons. And unfortunately, they had one player, King Vuniya Yawa, who got to the airport in Perpignan and they wouldn't let him in on his visa. I don't know what the problem was, but he had to come back home again. And that left them with a bare 18 players. And if you look at their pack, it was always going to struggle against the Catalans, and that's how it turned out. They were just overpowered, I think.
And geez, I think with Catalans, I've watched a few of their games since coming over to England. They're really impressive. They're gelling really well at the moment. I think like their back three, Tom Johnston on the wing, geez, he's been impressive lately.
Yes, I mean, of course, they signed him from Wakefield Trinity at the start of this season, and Tom had a lot of injury problems at Wakefield. He had a few concussions and also knee problem, but I'm so pleased for him that he's been injury-free so far this season. And, is shown what he can do, is competing right at the top of the try-scoring chart this season for Catalans. And touch wood, Tom carries on being injury-free. And if the Catalans do get to the grand final, you can guarantee that he will probably score 1 or 2 tries there, and they'll be not just ordinary tries that will turn on the crowd.
Spectacular ones.
Yeah.
And Wakefield Trinity, 42-6 over Warrington Wolves, which has seen the demise, unfortunately, of head coach Darryl Powell. What did you make of that game, and did you see it coming up?
Well, I've seen the highlights, and Wakefield were outstanding and, quite frankly, completely unrecognisable from the team they were, in at the start of the season and for much of the first half of the season. They seem to have been transformed by Luke Gale. I mean, Luke Gale is 35 years old now, and a few people questioned why Wakefield would sign him, because they signed him from Keighley Cougars from the Championship. And, Luke has had a great career and he's been a great player. But, of course, the question is, can he still do it at the age of 35? And he was up against George Williams playing for Warrington at the weekend, but Luke showed that he certainly can do it at the age of 35. His combination at halfback with Mason Leno was absolutely outstanding. And, he's given Wakefield a real chance of avoiding relegation. I mean, they're level now with Castleford, slightly inferior points difference, but nonetheless, it's anybody's guess which of those 2 clubs will get relegated this year now.
No, certainly. And obviously we had a tough-fought battle, Saints 22 over Leeds 18.
Yeah, I thought Leeds would win that game when you took into account some of the injuries that St Helens had, but they actually played with great spirit. They were obviously without Alex Wormsley, without Ignatius Passy, without Lou McCarthy-Scarsbrook, but nonetheless they played with incredible spirit against Leeds, and I thought they brought in a young prop, George Delaney, for one of his very rare starts in their side, and he's a big guy who looks, a bit of a Alex Wormsley clone to me. So, it's the good thing about injuries, if there is a good thing, is that they do give other players a chance to make an impression. And I thought young Delaney certainly looks to me like a player who has a big future for St Helens. So I think that, if you're a St Helens fan, that's incredibly encouraging.
Yeah, perfect. Promising future. Now, the other 2 games, probably won't dive into them too much. Hull KR 34 over Castleford 16, and the Giants 19 beat Hull FC 12.
Yes, I thought those games were fairly predictable in terms of the results. Castleford desperately need to get some points, but they were, up against not just the Hull KR team, but the Hull KR crowd. The crowd at Hull KR is incredibly partisan. They make an awful lot of noise. Bit intimidating, if we're really honest about it, in a positive way, not in a bad way. And I didn't think Castleford would win that game. Castleford haven't got a strong side out at the moment. And similarly, Hull needed the points at Huddersfield, but then Huddersfield needed them as well. It's interesting now just to look and see Huddersfield are on 16 points, 6 points outside the top 6, but with a game in hand, which is a game against St Helens. But nonetheless, they're not out of the top 6 race. And it's interesting that after 20 rounds of the competition with 7 to go, we've still got 10 teams in with a realistic chance of getting in the top 6, which I think is a great thing for the game and guarantees some really interesting matches over the next few weeks.
Oh, certainly. It's all starting to ramp up heading into playoffs. Now, we'll touch on some of the other news. Let's start with Darryl Powell, mutually parting ways with Warrington Wolves. Did this surprise you? Did you see it coming?
Well, we did sort of think it might be coming, but his dismissal pointed out the weakness of a printed newspaper, actually, because we go to print at roughly 8 o'clock on a Sunday night, and they announce this decision at 9 o'clock on Sunday night. You can
Very
imagine my reaction when I saw that coming through, and we didn't have it actually in the paper. So, nonetheless, we've actually had quite a lot of stuff on the website since then about it. Daryl, why Daryl couldn't make it work at Warrington is the biggest mystery of rugby league this season for me, because you've got to bear in mind that they won their first 8 games of the season. They were, played 8, 16 points, way ahead of everybody else, and then suddenly it all went pear-shaped, and I mean they've lost now 6 or 7 in a row. They've just slipped now to 6th place, right on the edge of the playoffs. One of the reasons for this, I think, is because they actually have lost 2 key forwards who they had signed for the start of the year in Josh Maguire, of course, who left the club after getting into trouble for making stupid comments on the field that, in this country are dealt with very harshly. Mm-hmm. And Thomas McKaylee, he went home I think at some point in May because he felt homesick. Although the strange thing is he's now coming back again and will be playing for Warrington again for the last 6 or so games of the season. So, but when you lose 2 major forwards like that, it certainly doesn't make it easy, does it? And I mean, I wouldn't say that's the whole reason for Warrington's poor showing in the latter part of this season so far, but it certainly plays a part. But, Daryl tried to reorganise the club, and a lot of his signings I don't think have worked as well as he would have probably hoped, and I think that's perhaps a significant part of the problem.
Yeah, it's as we touched on before we started recording, they're sitting in that sixth spot, I think, so they're still in playoff contention. I know from my background, I guess coaches are always on the hot seat, but it's hard to fathom, them parting ways this late into the season. Yeah,
it is, and they play Catalans at home on Friday night, which is a difficult game for them. I mean, it's a funny thing, when you get rid of a coach, sometimes a team rebounds and starts playing well again. Maybe they feel the shackles have been taken off them, but but having said that, it's difficult to know exactly how they will respond. But Daryl's an interesting character because, he did a great job at Castleford Tigers. In 2017, Castleford were way ahead of everybody else at the top of Super League. They got to the grand final that year, but unfortunately, on the week of the grand final, in fact, I think it was probably the day before, it was revealed that Zach Hardaker, who played full back for them, had tested positive for cocaine and had to withdraw from the game, obviously, and that seemed to upset them, and they never really fully recovered from that setback, and they lost the grand final that year to Leeds. And I've got to say, that Castleford team that year played a wonderful brand of rugby league. We've heard about baseball in cricket, haven't we? The England cricket team playing this incredibly adventurous style of cricket. Well, I think Darryl Powell invented a version of that for rugby league at Castleford in 2017, and it was wonderful to watch. The crowd were incredibly enthused by it, and I would like to see that come back again, wherever Daryl goes next. And I certainly don't think his coaching career is over. I know he's gone for a bit of a break in Tenerife for this week and maybe next, but I do think he'll be back. I'm not quite sure where that will be, though, of course, but he's now a coach who will be looking for a new opportunity somewhere.
For sure. And we've heard a lot in the media, a couple of rumours swirling around Justin Holbrook coming back to coach. You heard today that it's probably not going to happen.
We understand he's not coming to Warrington, which, those reports we take at face value. And I thought he might come back to this country for an attractive coaching job like that, but it seems that Justin's quite prepared to go to an assistant's job at one of the Sydney NRL clubs, probably the Bulldogs or the Roosters perhaps, or something like that. But we'd love to see him over here again because, he was the coach of St Helens. He took them to the... they've won the grand final 4 years in a row. He took them to the first of those 4. and was always a great bloke to deal with. A really positive guy. I liked him an awful lot, and I was very surprised when Gold Coast Titans, said goodbye to him earlier this year. I thought he was doing a pretty good job with the Titans, and I couldn't see what the point of making a change at that point was. But that's up to them, and obviously Justin was deeply upset by that decision. But we all have to move on, and but we'd certainly welcome him back to England at any time he wants to come.
It was certainly very tight-lipped when the Titans made that decision. I don't think anyone saw it coming.
No.
Obviously, they've got Des Hasler coming in to take over the reins on the Gold Coast. But, also news that he had been linked with the Newcastle Knights, but the way Adam O'Brien's going at the moment with the Knights...
I can't see the Knights getting rid of Adam O'Brien.
No, not at this stage anyway.
No.
Big win over Melbourne a few weeks ago. And
absolutely.
They're coming to form right at the right time of the
with
season.
Brian McDermott as their assistant coach, of course, an Englishman.
Yeah, we've got to shout out the Englishman.
Absolutely
for sure.
have, yes, of course.
Now, we'll move on. So there's been a lot of controversy of late around John Asiata's tackling technique. Obviously, we've seen 2 seasons, and there's been talk of possibly career-ending injuries for...
Well, Ignatius Parsi, there's a lot of talk that it could be career-ending. I mean, I hope it isn't. Yeah. And our best wishes go out to Ignatius and to Alex Walmsley, of course, the other guy who was injured by an Asiata tackle. But, yes, it provoked a lot of controversy when Paul Wellens spoke out very strongly at his press conference just over a week ago, in which he more or less accused Asiata of having an illegitimate tackling technique that wasn't reined in by the RFL's match review panel, which had said, Asiata didn't have a case to answer for those tackles, and that certainly upset everybody at St Helens.
It's quite tricky as well because I saw a comment, it might have been by, I can't remember who it was, but it's kind of like a cannonball tackle, but it's not a cannonball because there's no one else holding up top. So it's coming at the side of the legs, hitting the side of the knee, and you see the injury report with Ignatius Parsi, all the ligaments in his ankle. I think it was the ACL and the
everything
MCL.
In his leg is gone.
So I can only imagine that's going to be a really tough injury to rehab. We just had news today, actually, back home. A young player by the name of Aaron Booth, who was in the Gold Coast system. Last year, he tore his ACL, his MCL, and PCL. And today he announced his retirement from football at a young age. I think he's in his mid-20s. So a horrific injury to have to rehab. So best of luck and knock on wood that
absolutely
Parsi can recover from that. But it's one of those tackles that it's at the moment within the laws of the game around the legs. But what would be your approach? I see you've written an article in this week's edition.
Well, first of all, I have to say that I don't think John Asiata had any malicious intent in making that tackle. I think he was just trying to do his damnedest to make sure Parsi didn't score a try when it looked as though he was obviously going to. And it was a last-ditch tackle to prevent that happening. But having said that, insofar as I could interpret it, he seemed to go into... he was coming side on as Parsi was trying to get over the line, and he went into Parsi's knee or just above his knee with his shoulder side on, and you can imagine that was a massive force, and your knee, in terms of movement from side to side, has no flexibility whatsoever. So that sort of tackle is always likely to result in a serious knee injury to the player who's the subject of the tackle. So I think when we talk about tackling side on in rugby league, we normally talk about wrapping your arms around a player, maybe his upper legs, and sliding your arms down to make sure that the player being tackled falls to the ground, but aiming your body at a player a bit like a missile in a sense is much more likely to result in injury. And I think there's got to be an examination of this by the Rugby Football League. Whoever there is responsible for making decisions on the legitimacy of tackling technique, to see whether they can produce a definition of this tackle that would make it illegal and that would therefore give them the power to take action against somebody who perpetrates this sort of tackle. It's a tough one, though, because it's difficult to frame the wording of a law to actually catch everything. And, of course, there would be such a lot of room for debate, I suppose. But I think, in all fairness, we don't want to see players having such horrific injuries as this if we can possibly avoid it. So, it's worth doing, even though it's a pretty difficult thing to do.
At the moment in the NRL, obviously we've had the hip drop tackle be introduced and quickly outlawed. Now, one of the issues with that tackle is it tends to only be penalised when there is a player that's gone down with an injury. Sometimes not, but more often than not, once the replay comes up and the referee gets a chance to have a look at it, then the penalty's given. My worry with this is if we do decide to outlaw the tackle, how is it going to be policed? Refs, are they going to get a good viewing angle of someone coming from the side?
It's really interesting, isn't it, that? Yeah, because the trouble is, when you're watching the actual match live, as a live thing, everything happens so quickly that you don't really see the complete detail of a tackle. You see a player being injured, obviously lying on the ground, struggling to carry on, but if you're actually at the ground, you don't normally see the replay of the injury, do you? If you've not got a big screen there, particularly. So it does raise an awful lot of questions, and for a referee, I mean, English rugby league fans love nothing more than to criticise referees. And I'm sure the same is probably true of Australia. And yet I think refereeing a rugby league match is probably one of the hardest jobs in the world, personally. And it's something, and I many years ago, when I was much younger than I am now, I refereed a student rugby league game. And I thought it was going to be easy, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Because I suddenly realised how much I didn't know about the rules of the game, and I never wanted to do it again. So, I've got complete sympathy for referees, and not just sympathy for them, but admiration for them. And, to see these young guys, and they are mainly young guys these days, to see them taking on this responsibility, it's just something I wouldn't want to do. And so I'm always very restrained, Jake, in my criticism of referees. I often get readers saying, why don't you come down harder on them? But, there but for the grace of God go I suppose.
That's right. And we're all human. We make mistakes
absolutely.
too. And a lot of things in sport, it's always up to the interpretation, and where you are, where your position on the field, how well you saw it. So it's an interesting one, something that they might have to look at over the off-season. But fingers crossed those two players, Alex Walmsley and Ignatius, can recover from that.
Well, let's hope.
We'll move on to now. The IRL has convened in Singapore this week, I believe. There's a bit of news around what's going to happen with the next World Cup. What are you hearing around this, Martyn?
Well, the next World Cup now will be played in 2026, not 2025, which was the original year that it would be played. It will be down to 10 teams, not 16. So it's going to be a reduced system. And of those 10 teams, the 8 teams that got to the quarter-final of last year's World Cup will be automatic entrants. So that means 6 Southern Hemisphere teams. I think if we can go through them, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, Papua New Guinea and Tonga. And then 2 Northern Hemisphere teams, England and Lebanon. And then there will be 2 more teams that will qualify through qualifying tournaments. So you would expect the 2 other teams to qualify would be France and the Cook Islands, probably, I would imagine, at a guess. So it will be a 10-team competition. I'm not quite sure what the format of the competition will be at this stage. Obviously, it will be at the end of the 2026 season. And I believe that both Australia and New Zealand are going to be given the chance to bid to stage the tournament, probably on a joint basis. And there may well be some games played at other places, for example, in Port Moresby at Papua New Guinea. So It's disappointing that it's gone from 16 to 10 because, I quite enjoyed having all those teams involved. But I can understand it in a way because staging a 16-team competition is quite a big ask, I think, financially. It's a big financial commitment, and I'm not sure that Rugby League internationally has the financial wherewithal to be able to do that. We did it in England last year with a massive payment by the British government, but I'm not sure that will be forthcoming in the same scale in 2026 from Australia or New Zealand. So, the World Cup needs to be rebuilt. But it's not just the World Cup, is it? It's, we are going to be having tours again. I think, England will tour, or Great Britain will tour Australia in an old-style Ashes series. New Zealand and Australia will both come to England as well, and there'll be a fairly significant international calendar to go alongside that, involving other nations. Mm-hmm. So we've got to take it at face value. We've got our regrets about the reduced number of teams in the World Cup, but hopefully this is the way forward.
Mm. And I guess it's one of those things like we had. This will be the second World Cup, I guess, that's had to be rejigged. I think the first one, obviously, COVID had a little bit to do with it. But
yes,
how important is it that we get this next one right?
Oh, I think it's really vital. You've got to bear in mind, World Cups are cropping up in all sorts of other sports now. We're seeing the FIFA Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand at the moment, which I think is an outstanding success, to be honest, with some of the crowds in Australia in particular, absolutely tremendous for the female soccer players, and it's amazing to see, who would have imagined that happening 20 or so years ago. It's a changed environment. So we've got to, the trouble with our sport, Jake, is that we don't seem to spend all that much on marketing it. We spend most of our resources on improving the quality of the game on the field. But unless you've got a message to bring in new supporters as well, with a significant marketing budget that promotes the excitement and thrills and so on that you can get from watching rugby league, then you're never going to make it work. I mean, I think the 2017 tournament, which was held in Australia, was not a great financial success, I don't think, and the crowds were disappointing, quite frankly, compared to the crowds in 2013 in this country. So, I don't think... I think the international board has got to think very carefully about how it actually promotes interest in the competition. It's really got to think carefully how it's going to build up. Other sports are far better at doing that, including rugby union. They know how to organise a World Cup to get the maximum number of crowds and the maximum interest, and for their international game. And we need to learn to do the same thing. And it's if we're going to have this tournament in 26, it's got to be successful. You're absolutely right.
No, absolutely. Hopefully, maybe the IRL can look to poach a few of those organisers from the
let's hope so.
Rugby Union.
Yeah.
Now, I'm happy with that in terms of news of the week. Is there any other news that you'd like to touch on?
Well, one of the things that the international body has said that I'm slightly disappointed by is that they're not going to proceed with a Rugby League Nines World Tournament. I'm a great lover of Rugby League Nines, in fact, and I love the NRL pre-season Nines when they had that a few years ago in Auckland, because Nines Rugby League is a great leveler as far as I'm concerned. You can get teams from various countries in the world who are not Australia or England or New Zealand, who can put out quite respectable nines teams, and you actually end up having a much more equal tournament than you otherwise would. And I mean, I've got a bit of a bugbear as well. I was talking to you, before we started this about, there are a lot of young kids coming through the rugby league ranks in this country at the moment who were either born in various African countries or who have got a very strong African heritage. And I would love to see a Nines tournament, for example, that had a team representing the whole of Africa playing, against England, Australia, New Zealand, whatever. And I think that would be a great promotional vehicle to spread our game to more countries in Africa, which is already happening. There's a lot of rugby league being played in various African countries at the moment, and there are some great athletes on that continent who I think would make great rugby league players if they had the right coaching and background and encouragement and so on. So I hope the international body will reconsider its views on nines rugby and come back and set up some tournaments.
No, certainly. I think that'd be a great idea. And if you've got speed, you can pass a football and you can make a tackle.
Absolutely.
You can thrive in rugby league nines, I think.
Absolutely right.
Now, looking forward to this week's games. Is there any in particular that you're looking forward to delving into? Just for me, looking at them, be interesting to see how the Wolves bounce back after their
against Catalans. I think they'll have a tough ask on Friday night. It's that's the game that's on Sky on Friday night. On Sunday, Hull FC versus Wakefield Trinity. Now, that's going to be really crucial because Hull desperately need the points to sustain a top six challenge. They're outside the top six at the moment. They're in ninth. Mm-hmm. They're 4 points outside the six. They desperately need to win, but Wakefield desperately need to win too to try and keep fighting away from the relegation position. Mm-hmm. Castleford versus Huddersfield on Friday night. Castleford, they've got Blake Austin now from Leeds. They've just taken him on loan. Amazing decision. Apparently, Leeds coach Rowan Smith said he didn't know anything about that until he learned about it on Thursday morning. Which is an amazing thing for him to admit in a way. Mm. So, in other words, the deal with Castleford was done without him knowing anything about it. Amazing.
It's bizarre.
It certainly is. But Blake Austin will not be playing for Castleford, I don't think, on Friday night against Huddersfield. Or at least I don't think so. But Castleford desperately need a win. But then Huddersfield desperately need a win too because, again, their top six aspirations are hanging by a thread, and they, both sides have got to win. So there are quite a lot of games like that this weekend where both sides need to win, and it's always great to see that sort of thing, isn't it?
Oh, certainly. What will happen with Blake Austin? So does he have to? Can he come back to Leeds if Leeds were?
Well, as far as I understand it, Blake's contract runs out at the end of this season, and he's gone now to Castleford for the rest of the season.
Right.
So, he's looking for a new club from next year. I mean, the problem was that Leeds offered him a 1-year deal and he wanted a 2-year deal. And he was holding out for it and kept holding out for it and kept commenting publicly about that, which probably I don't think Leeds liked very much, if we're honest about it. But he's now a free agent for next year. And, I think Blake has played really well for Leeds in the last 2 or 3 months probably, and his career is far from over, and I think he'll be a great signing for somebody. I'm not quite sure who at this stage, but he's still a fine player and has what it takes.
Absolutely. Now, early Challenge Cup predictions ahead of next week. Who do you like in these early stages? We can touch on it again next week.
Well, I think. Lee and Hulkingston Rovers have played each other twice this season so far. I think it was right on the 3rd of March, if I remember, the first time. And Lee won at Hulkingston Rovers 25-20 with a late converted try. They were a point down. And I think it was Josh Charnley from memory who scored the winning try. And that was Lee's first win in Super League, and it was Solskjaer's first defeat in Super League this year. Mm-hmm. So that, if that's an omen, it suggests we're going to get a very exciting game at Wembley. Mm. I mean, it'd be great to think it would go all the way to the wire, with one side winning near the end. I think Lee are probably the slight favourites, but only slight. And the way Hulkingston Rovers played against Wigan, you can't underestimate them at all. And of course, they've got this guy Brad Schneider, who's the The expert at winning games with a late field goal.
Yeah.
He's won 2 at Leeds. Both were at Leeds, actually. With the first one against Leeds, the second one against Wigan in the Cup semi-final. I think he's been an inspired signing so far, and he could well be the man who wins the game for them at Wembley. Who knows? It's. I think this is. It's a long time, Jake, since I've looked forward to a final quite as much as this one, because it's great to see 2 teams. I mean, Lee last won it in 1971, Hull KR in 1980. So both teams are long overdue winning a major trophy, and one of them is going to win it this year. So I think that's marvellous. I hope. I mean, I hear that ticket sales are going pretty well for the game. I hope that's true, and we'll look forward to a great day at Wembley this year.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'm happy to wrap it up here if you are, Martyn.
That's marvellous. Thank you.
Fingers crossed, and thanks for listening to all our listeners. If you've made it this far in the podcast, really appreciate it, and hopefully check back in
all
next
those
week.
who are still listening at this stage. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, Jake. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Martyn.